Hi, it's Pastor Jane here. We just a couple weeks ago celebrated Mother's Day, and in a couple weeks more, we'll celebrate Father's Day. And it's had me thinking, why do we even need to have a day specially set aside to honor mothers first and then to honor fathers second? And I think it's because we don't do a good enough job of Romans 12, verse 10, which says, take delight in honoring each other. We just don't do it well. In fact, as we look at the rest of the year and how often women are denigrated, are abused, are mistreated, and yet on the other hand, men, how often we find them being held to account to levels that they can never achieve, being made to feel as though they represent all of mankind and haven't done a good job and need to pull up their socks. Neither one of those approaches is honoring to men or to women. And I think we need to get back to what God intended for us. And here's a challenging thought. In preparing for this talk, I've had a chance to go through the book of Ephesians. Now, we love to just kind of land on certain verses in the book of Ephesians. And especially there's those very volatile ones in Ephesians 5 that talk about submission and men and women. But if we want to look at the topic of submission, and I think we need to, it's become a dirty word, but really it is a key ingredient to our spiritual maturing and unity as Christians, submission to one another. And if we take a look at Paul's letter, remember, we put in the chapters and verses. He didn't. It's one progressive thought of his. And so if we were to take ourselves back to chapter 4, we find submission as a major topic right from that point on, all the way to the end of the letter. It doesn't call it submission, but what's he talking about when he says that we are to live in the way of God? That's submission. It takes submitting my desires, my free choice, my will to be in control. He talks about submitting ourselves to the transforming work of the Holy Spirit. There are things in our lives that have to change, character qualities that just are not good representation of who we are to be as God's children. And so there's an element of needing to submit ourselves. Again, our choices, our desires, our habits, our way of doing things to the Holy Spirit, and then not fighting him when he wants to change something. We also see in that chapter the need to submit to one another, to maintain peace, to maintain unity. These are all so very important. And then in chapter 5, starting verse 21, he says we are to submit to one another. He's just continuing his thought of submitting to one another, but then he does a very interesting thing. And he identifies 3 different relationships that existed back in his day and still today to some extent, where hierarchy was the norm. And he tells each side in the equation how they are to submit to one another. Now, the first individual in each of these relationships, they would have taken it I know, I got to do that. And then he drops a bombshell because the person in perceived authority, perceived control, is also told to submit to the other. So let's break this down a little bit. The first relationship he talks about in the need for mutual submission is the marriage relationship between wife and husband. Now, in the Greco-Roman world, the husband was in charge. There is no doubt about it. His say went. And so when Paul says, wives, submit to your husbands, well, okay, that's a no-brainer. He does add, though, as you submit to Christ. Now, that would have been, it would have checked him. It's almost like this is something I do because I choose to do it. That would have been different. But then he continues with the husbands. And he says, submit to your wives. Wait a second. Does he say submit to your wives? Absolutely. As Christ loved the church, husbands are to love their wives as their own selves. They are to care for, not rule over. They are to look for the best, not top-down authority. They are to mutually submit. Now, I know not everybody will agree with me. Let's take a look at the next relationship pair that Paul tackles of children and parents. And so he says to children, obey your parents. This is right. You should do this. It's the first command with a promise. And everybody would have shaken heads. Yes, yes, yes. Then again, he drops a bombshell, identifying fathers and saying, do not exasperate your children, but train them up well. He wants parents to show their children what submission looks like through their actual submission to their children and their needs. Children are not simply to be seen and not heard. We are to engage with them. We are to train them up. We are to show them what mutual submission looks like together. They submit out of obedience. We submit to them out of their needs. The final pairing, slaves and masters. And we might say, well, we don't actually have slaves and masters, but think about it. This is quite astounding, actually. When Paul says to slaves, obey your masters, even when they aren't watching. Do it because it's not them you're serving, but do it as serving God. Well, that would have been big. That would have been big because for them, the slaves are just like, well, when the eye of the master's on me, I will do what I need to do, but I might not be so diligent when it's not. But he's saying, think of your master as not being people, but as God. But then he drops the bombshell again, and he says, masters, do likewise. God doesn't show favorites. So if you mistreat your slaves now, don't think you won't be held to account. You need to treat them as a brother because you both have the same master. So this principle of submission, a word that we don't like, it sounds like giving up. It sounds like caving in, all of which have negative connotations. But it's really releasing my will to the will of God and allowing him to work in me and through me towards not only my relationship with him and allowing the Holy Spirit to work within me, but my relationship with other people around me. And when we submit to one another, when we stop demanding to have our own way, we will once again find our purpose as the church to demonstrate God's love that he has done through us, for us, that we can then show to others too. And that's my talk for today.